October 29, 2025, Tanzania held a presidential election that was supposed to reaffirm the country's political stability, but instead ignited a wave of turmoil. Samia Suluhu Hassan was declared the winner with nearly 98% of the vote, after her main rivals were excluded from the ballot. The results provoked widespread outrage across the nation. Protests erupted in major cities, the internet was cut off, and security forces responded with brutal force. Accusations of mass killings, secret burials, and enforced disappearances began to surface. In response to the mounting pressure, President Samia announced the creation of a special commission to investigate the deadly clashes. This story examines how that investigation was launched and what it means for a country at a tipping point. In the months leading up to the October 2025 election, Tanzania entered a period of growing political unease, the kind that builds quietly, layer by layer, until the entire nation can sense that something is about to give. On the surface, the government projected confidence. Rallies were held. Banners adorned buildings. State media praised the leadership of President Samia Suluhu Hassan, repeating the message that the country was stable, united, and progressing. But beneath that polished exterior lay a country simmering with tension, distrust, and fear. The first sign that this election would not follow a normal path appeared when opposition leaders were systematically pushed out of the race. Tundu Lissu, the country's most influential opposition figure, remained imprisoned on treason charges his supporters insisted were politically motivated. Another major challenger, Luhaga Mpina of ACT Wazalendo, was abruptly disqualified from the ballot. To many Tanzanians, these exclusions signaled that the 2025 election was already decided before voting even began. With these candidates removed, people began to whisper that the election was a one-person show. Critics accused the government of weaponizing the legal system to cripple political competition. Human rights groups spoke of escalating intimidation, sudden disappearances of activists, and unexplained arrests in the weeks before the vote. Families who had lived through earlier elections could feel the atmosphere thickening, the same uneasy air that hangs before a storm breaks. As the election approached, the streets were filled with a strange mixture of quiet and anxiety. On one hand, everyday life continued. Markets still bustled, buses still rattled down narrow roads, fishermen still cast their nets along the coast. But on the other hand, conversations grew hushed. People lowered their voices when discussing politics. Parents warned their children not to stay out late. Community leaders advised caution. Tanzania was functioning but not breathing. Then came Election Day, October 29, 2025. From the very first hour, it was clear this would not be an ordinary civic exercise. At polling stations, military and police presence was unusually heavy. Some citizens claimed to have seen officers standing near ballot boxes, a sight that immediately heightened fears of intimidation. Opposition supporters who attempted to monitor the vote were allegedly turned away or detained. Videos circulating through private messages, because posting publicly had become dangerous, showed crowds arguing with officials at closed polling stations, demanding transparency. As more citizens realized the scale of exclusion and irregularities, frustration boiled over. In neighborhoods with a long history of political activism, people began pouring into the streets even before the vote counting was complete. Many were young, angry, and determined to make their voices heard. They carried placards, shouted chants, and called for accountability. Others simply marched in silence, believing that their presence alone could demonstrate that they refused to be silenced. What began as peaceful gatherings quickly became confrontational. Security forces, anticipating unrest, had already been deployed in large numbers. The response was swift and severe. Tear gas canisters were fired into crowds. Riot police advanced with shields raised. Protesters threw stones. Officers retaliated with batons. The chaos spread rapidly through Dar es Salaam, Arusha, Mwanza, and Dodoma. Streets that had been busy with everyday life only hours earlier were now filled with smoke, fleeing crowds, and the thundering footsteps of heavily armed personnel. As tensions escalated, the government took a decisive step. A sudden and sweeping internet shutdown. Mobile networks faltered, messaging apps stopped working, and entire regions went dark online. People tried desperately to contact family or share what they were seeing, only to find their phones useless. The shutdown created confusion and fear, but it also prevented the outside world from immediately seeing the scale of what was unfolding. By evening, curfews had been declared in several major cities. Roads that normally bustled with boda-bodas and buses went empty. Only the sound of sirens and the echo of distant clashes filled the night. Homes were locked from the inside. Parents comforted terrified children. In some areas, ambulances sped through neighborhoods, carrying the wounded to overcrowded hospitals. Doctors later described how injured protesters arrived with gunshot wounds, deep cuts, and bruises. Some were unconscious. Others whispered that their friends had been taken away by masked men. Nurses moved frantically from one patient to another, knowing they were witnessing the beginning of something terrifying. Across the country, Tanzanians began to realize that this election would not pass quietly. It would leave scars. It would demand answers. And soon, it would force the government to launch investigations into what had really happened. Investigations that would become the center of the nation's attention. As the chaos of Election Day gave way to night, Tanzania entered one of the darkest chapters in its recent history. The tension that had been building for months finally ruptured, spilling into the streets in ways no one could fully control. What had begun as scattered protests earlier in the day transformed into large-scale confrontations that spread across the country like wildfire. It was during these critical hours that the seeds for future investigations were planted, because the violence that unfolded could not simply be erased with silence. The first signs of deeper trouble came shortly after sundown. In Dar es Salaam's densely populated districts, protesters refused to retreat despite curfews. Young men and women chanted into the night, banging pots, blowing whistles, and waving flags as if trying to pierce the heavy darkness that hung over the city. Their message was simple. Their votes had been stolen, and they would not go home quietly. Security forces, already stretched thin, began using more aggressive tactics. Witnesses described police vehicles racing through the streets, sirens blaring, while officers fired tear gas into tightly packed crowds. Some residents claimed they heard live rounds being fired, sharp, distinct cracks that echoed off buildings and reverberated through neighborhoods. As the clashes intensified, people ran in every direction, stumbling over debris, choking from the chemicals in the air, crying out in fear. In some areas, the violence escalated beyond what many had ever imagined. Protesters set barricades on fire, using whatever they could find, tires, wooden crates, scrap metal, to block the advance of riot police. Flames lit up the sky, casting an eerie glow over the city and making the smoke rising from the streets visible even from neighboring districts. Helicopters circled overhead, their lights sweeping across rooftops as if searching for fugitives in a war zone. But it wasn't only Dar es Salaam. In Mwanza, reports began filtering in of clashes near the city center. Families hiding inside their homes could hear the distant popping of tear gas canisters and the heavy thuds of stun grenades. In Arusha, protesters gathered near government buildings, refusing to disperse, chanting slogans demanding democracy and transparency. Some were beaten, others arrested. The fear in the air was palpable, and the sense of national unity that Tanzania prided itself on began to fracture under the weight of the crisis. As all this unfolded, communication remained patchy. The internet shutdown crippled activists' attempts to document the violence. Panic spread as people tried calling loved ones and received only dead signals. With information blocked and rumors swirling, confusion took root. Some believed dozens had been killed. Others whispered that the number was far higher. Hospitals quietly reported an influx of wounded, yet doctors were warned not to reveal too much. Ambulances came and went, their sirens slicing through the night repeatedly, transporting civilians whose only crime had been raising their voices. By midnight, the situation had grown so grave that many families simply prayed. They heard gunfire, shouting, and the steady rumble of armored vehicles passing their homes. Parents told their children to hide under beds. Some residents turned off their lights, hoping to make their homes appear empty. For many, It was the longest and most terrifying night they had ever endured. When dawn finally broke, the light revealed a country changed. Streets were stained and littered with charred debris. Burnt barricades lay scattered like fragments of a bad dream. The air still carried the faint smell of tear gas. In some neighborhoods, silence reigned, the heavy, oppressive silence that follows trauma. But even in daylight, the truth remained difficult to uncover. Security forces sealed off certain areas, preventing journalists and observers from entering. Residents claimed that bodies had been taken away before sunrise, removed swiftly and quietly in an attempt to erase evidence of the previous night's brutality. Families searching for missing relatives filled police stations and hospitals, desperate for answers. Some were turned away. Others waited for hours, fearing the worst. It was in these chaotic days, marked by grief, uncertainty, and anger, that calls for formal investigations grew louder. Opposition leaders demanded accountability. Civil society groups insisted that independent observers be allowed to examine what had happened. International pressure mounted. Tanzanians wanted to know who ordered the violence, how many people died, where were the missing taken, and why had their voices been met with bullets. Even as the government tried to contain the narrative, the scale of the crisis made it impossible to bury everything. The demand for truth was too strong. Evidence was emerging despite the blackout. Footage smuggled out of the country showed clashes, injuries, and chaos. Survivors began telling their stories. Families spoke of sons and daughters who never came home. And with every testimony, the urgency for an investigation grew, pushing the nation toward a moment of reckoning that no one could avoid. In the days that followed the eruption of violence, Tanzania found itself plunged into an uneasy quiet, the kind of silence that doesn't signal peace, but rather fear, uncertainty, and hidden wounds. The streets slowly reopened, the smoke cleared, and life began to resume on the surface. But beneath that fragile calm, a new and more disturbing crisis had begun to unfold. People were missing, families were searching, rumors were multiplying, and the government, despite trying to project control, could not suppress the growing suspicion that something far more sinister had happened during the unrest. At first, the disappearances seemed isolated. A young protester who left home and never returned. A father pulled from a crowd by unknown men in uniforms. A college student last seen running from a group of officers. Their families went to police stations, only to be told that no record existed of their arrest. Hospitals said they hadn't received anyone by those names. Officials insisted the situation was under control, urging the public to remain calm. But as more names surfaced, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Neighborhoods began compiling their own lists of the missing. Handwritten scraps of paper, chalked names on community boards, phone notes circulated among friends. Mothers walked door to door asking if anyone had seen their children. Youth groups searched abandoned buildings, fields, and riverbanks. Religious leaders held prayer meetings, comforting families who feared the worst. The emotional toll grew heavier by the day, as stories of mysterious nighttime arrests and quiet disappearances spread faster than the government could contain them. Then came the first whispers that bodies had been found. Not in hospitals, not in police custody, but in remote areas behind thickets, in forests, and near riverbeds. Villagers claimed to have seen vehicles arriving late at night, headlights off, moving in silence. Some said they saw men unloading something wrapped in tarps. Others heard digging, hurried and forceful. The most chilling reports described shallow graves discovered by herders or children playing in fields. Graves that appeared fresh and quickly filled in, as if someone wanted to hide something urgently. Whether these stories were true or exaggerated, one thing was certain. Fear began spreading faster than any official statement could counter. Tanzanians had lived through difficult times before, but this time felt different. Darker, deeper, and deliberately concealed. Survivors of the protests started speaking out. Some described brutal beatings. Others recalled being dragged into unmarked vehicles, held for hours in cramped, suffocating rooms, and then released with stern warnings to stay silent. Several insisted that they saw people being taken away who never returned. Their testimony painted a picture not of random violence, but of coordinated operations carried out with purpose and precision. As these accounts multiplied, civil society organizations stepped in. Independent lawyers, rights groups, and student associations began collecting testimonies from families and survivors. They documented injuries, arrests, threats, and disappearances. They gathered names, dates, descriptions of officers, and locations of alleged secret burials. Their goal was simple: to preserve evidence before it vanished. Journalists, both local and international, attempted to investigate, but many found themselves blocked by authorities. Some were threatened. Others had equipment confiscated. The internet blackout, although gradually easing, continued to hinder their work. Still, small fragments of truth leaked out. Photos smuggled through VPNs, blurry videos sent to foreign contacts, audio recordings from terrified witnesses. These fragments slowly assembled into a mosaic of horror. Opposition leaders seized the moment. They held press conferences, revealing lists of alleged victims, and insisting that the government had carried out a massive cover-up. They claimed that hundreds, possibly more, had been killed or disappeared during the protests. For many Tanzanians, these allegations didn't sound far-fetched. They felt painfully plausible. Public pressure swelled. Rallies demanding transparency grew larger, even though attending them was dangerous. Families of missing people marched with pictures of their loved ones, their faces drawn with grief but hardened with determination. They gathered outside government buildings, chanting for truth. They stood outside police stations demanding answers. Their tears became symbols of a nation's collective pain. Under mounting pressure, the government could no longer dismiss the crisis outright. Officials began issuing statements expressing regret and concern. But these did little to calm the nation. Citizens wanted answers, not condolences. They wanted to know what happened in the dark corners of those chaotic nights. They wanted accountability for every bullet fired, every life taken, every person who vanished without explanation. And that is when the calls for a full-scale investigation, a real formal inquiry, became impossible to ignore. Civil society groups demanded an independent commission. Opposition leaders insisted on international involvement. Religious leaders called for truth and reconciliation. Even some government allies acknowledged that transparency was necessary to restore trust. The nation, battered and grieving, was standing at the edge of a truth it was no longer willing to run from. The people wanted justice. They wanted clarity. They wanted to know what happened and who was responsible. The stage was now set for one of the most consequential investigations in Tanzania's modern history, an inquiry that would either reveal the truth or expose even deeper cracks in the system. As the weeks passed, the investigators slowly realized that numbers on official reports could only reveal half the truth. What truly exposed the scale of what had happened after the election were the voices, the ordinary Tanzanians who had lived through every moment of the chaos. And so, Section 4 begins not in a government office, but in the emotional trenches of people whose lives had been shaped, scarred, and in some cases forever changed by the violence that erupted across Tanzania. The investigation team began by traveling to the regions that had reported the highest number of disturbances. Their first stop was the outskirts of Tanga, where a group of families had fled their homes on election night. They gathered in a small, crowded community hall, the air thick with the silence of people who had never before been asked to recount their trauma. When the investigators finally invited them to speak, it was as if a floodgate opened. One elderly man stood up, his hands trembling slightly. He spoke slowly, describing how the peaceful village he had lived in for decades transformed into a battlefield in just a few hours. He recalled young men running through the streets, some armed with sticks, others with stones, shouting that the election had been stolen. He remembered the sound of glass shattering, the frantic cries of mothers trying to gather their children, the warning shots fired into the air by security officers who struggled to regain control. His eyes grew moist as he concluded by saying, "We are not politicians. We are just people who wanted to vote and go home." Then there were the youth, the group that many believed had been the spark that ignited the tensions. Some had joined the protests willingly. Others found themselves dragged into confrontations they never intended to be part of. One young man, barely in his early 20s, admitted he had been swept up in the anger of the moment. He explained that misinformation had played a major role. Rumors had spread like wildfire through social media. Claims of ballot stuffing, missing tally sheets, and altered vote counts. Whether true or not, the rumors had fueled a rage that no one knew how to contain. "We reacted before we understood," he confessed quietly. "And by the time we realized what was true and what was not, it was too late." But not all testimonies were from victims or protesters. The investigators also interviewed police officers, many of whom had been stationed on the front lines. One officer described the impossible situation they faced that night. They were ordered to keep peace, yet they were also told to enforce strict elections laws that the public believed had been abused. He explained how they were met with stones, insults, and at times complete distrust. And yet, according to him, some officers responded with excessive force, not out of orders, but out of fear and confusion. "When you are surrounded by hundreds of angry people," he said, "your mind does not always choose the best response." Perhaps the most heartbreaking testimonies came from women who encountered violence not because they were part of the protests, but simply because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Many spoke about how they had been caught between police and crowds, shoved to the ground, injured, or forced to abandon their homes. One mother described sprinting with her toddler on her back through thick smoke and screaming crowds, desperately trying to reach safety. "My child will grow up remembering that night," she whispered, "and he will not understand why his home turned into a place of fear." These testimonies, collected over weeks, began to form a disturbing mosaic of what had really occurred. The investigators realized that the post-election violence had not been a series of isolated incidents. It had been a chain reaction. Rumors fed anger, anger fueled protests, protests triggered police responses, and those responses intensified the chaos. And beneath it all was a deeper issue. Many citizens felt unheard, unrepresented, and uncertain whether the election results truly reflected their will. As the investigation team pieced together these narratives, a silent truth emerged. The violence was not merely about who won the election, it was about trust. Trust in the process, trust in the government, trust in the systems meant to protect them. Once that trust was shaken, everything else crumbled like a fragile foundation under weight it could no longer bear. The investigators had gathered enough testimonies to paint a compelling but painful picture of Tanzania's post-election reality. The question that now loomed over them was simple but heavy. With so many conflicting experiences and emotions, how could they craft a final report that was fair, honest, and capable of preventing such violence from happening again? While domestic investigators collected testimonies from communities across Tanzania, the outside world was watching closely. In the days following the controversial election, international attention shifted toward the country as several global news organizations and human rights groups began conducting their own inquiries. Their goal was not to interfere in Tanzania's internal affairs, but to understand whether the post-election violence was a localized incident or part of a broader pattern that required global attention. Foreign correspondents from major outlets like CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, and several African regional news networks traveled across Tanzania to document the rising tension. They interviewed witnesses, filmed the aftermath of clashes, and spoke to local leaders who were willing to comment. Because these journalists were not bound by internal political pressures, many Tanzanians found it easier to speak with them than with national investigators. Some citizens hoped that international visibility would encourage accountability. Others simply wanted the world to know what they had endured. CNN's East Africa Bureau sent a team that focused on areas where the most intense confrontations had been reported. Their documentary-style footage captured the scattered debris left behind on protest routes, burned kiosks, and damaged security vehicles. In interviews, some locals described feeling that the election process had lacked transparency. Others said the violence had started after social media posts claimed irregularities at certain polling stations. The CNN team noted how quickly misinformation had spread and how deeply it had influenced public perception, feeding the cycle of distrust. BBC correspondents approached the situation through long-form reporting. They spent time with community elders, youth groups, and activists from both opposition and ruling party strongholds. Their findings painted a complex picture. While some communities insisted that security forces had used unnecessary force, others argued that officers were overwhelmed and acted out of panic rather than intent. BBC journalists highlighted one recurring theme. Everyone felt uncertain about who was responsible for what. The lines between protest, panic, and provocation were blurred, making the truth difficult to untangle. Meanwhile, international observer missions, including several from African civil society organizations and global human rights groups, released detailed preliminary reports. These organizations had monitored the election from the beginning, and now they shifted their attention to the unrest that followed. Their assessments pointed to several contributing factors: insufficient transparency at certain tallying centers, inconsistent enforcement of election regulations, and communication breakdowns between electoral officials and the public. Some observers recommended reforms while emphasizing that violence, regardless of who initiated it, had undermined public trust in the democratic process. Human rights groups conducted interviews that echoed the testimony gathered by domestic investigators, but they added a crucial layer: documentation. They compiled photographs, witness statements, medical reports, and timestamp videos from the night of the clashes. They analyzed patterns, looking for whether the violence was spontaneous or coordinated. Their findings suggested that although most of the unrest erupted organically from frustration and misinformation, isolated incidents had escalated due to poor crowd management and mixed responses from security units. Al Jazeera's team focused heavily on the digital dimension. They traced the viral posts that had fueled many of the rumors circulating on election night. They spoke with tech experts who explained how certain images had been taken out of context, edited, or shared without verification. Their investigation revealed that some posts claiming attacks or vote tampering were actually old images from previous years, recycled during the tense hours after voting closed. This digital confusion had played a powerful role in transforming uncertainty into unrest. By the time these international reports circulated globally, the narrative surrounding Tanzania's post-election violence had expanded beyond simple accusations. It became clear that the situation was far more layered. There were structural issues within the electoral system, communication failures, emotional reactions from citizens, inconsistencies in police responses, and a digital environment that had amplified fear. All these external investigations, when placed alongside the findings of domestic teams, deepened the picture. Tanzania was not merely dealing with a disputed election. It was confronting the consequences of a fragile trust that had been eroded slowly over time. And now the investigators had an even bigger challenge: how to integrate international perspectives into their final analysis without appearing biased, and how to ensure that their recommendations would address both internal and external concerns. As the investigations grew more detailed and the findings became harder to ignore, a new force began to push itself into the center of the story: political pressure. What had started as an inquiry into post-election violence was slowly turning into a battle over narratives, legitimacy, and national reputation. Inside government offices, party headquarters, and security agencies, there was a tension no one wanted to talk about publicly, but everyone could feel. Behind closed doors, the ruling party was worried. International media coverage had shown a harsh spotlight on the country, and while none of the reports directly accused the government of orchestrating violence, the tone of global attention was enough to unsettle senior officials. They knew that Tanzania had always prided itself on stability, and now the world was questioning whether the recent election had cracked that image. The leadership wanted answers, but they also wanted control. Investigators began noticing subtle shifts. Some regional commanders who had been willing to share detailed accounts suddenly became guarded. Certain documents that were once easy to obtain now required additional approvals, sometimes from higher offices that had never before involved themselves in routine inquiries. A few investigators privately admitted they felt watched, as though someone was making sure the direction of the investigation didn't lean toward politically damaging conclusions. Inside the corridors of power, debates were growing heated. Some officials argued that acknowledging excessive force or procedural mistakes would restore public trust. Others insisted that admitting errors, especially after such a contested election, would fuel the opposition and weaken the presidency at a moment when unity was desperately needed. These disagreements created a silent tug-of-war, the truth versus political survival. The opposition parties saw the investigations as their opportunity to expose what they believed had been systemic problems in the electoral process. They organized press conferences, released statements, and used their platforms to push investigators to be bold. They demanded accountability for the violence, transparency in the votes, and reforms in the Electoral Commission. But their involvement also added pressure, because now every word from investigators could be interpreted as taking sides. Within this heated environment, civil society groups and human rights activists found themselves walking on a thin line. On one hand, they wanted the findings to be completely honest. On the other, they understood that pushing too aggressively risked getting their organizations labeled as politically motivated. Some activists received anonymous warnings telling them to be careful with their criticism. A few offices reported mysterious break-ins where only documents related to the election were disturbed. Meanwhile, foreign diplomats in Dar es Salaam closely monitored the situation. They held private meetings with Tanzanian officials, urging transparency and calm. They did not want to interfere openly, but it was obvious that they were hoping for a resolution that would reassure international investors and maintain regional stability. Any perception of a disputed presidency could unsettle diplomatic relations and economic partnerships. Inside the investigation team, the pressure reached a breaking point when a high-level official attempted to influence how certain incidents should be interpreted in the final report. The message was clear: focus on the role of misinformation, mention police mistakes as isolated cases, and avoid suggesting any failures at the national level. Some investigators refused to comply, insisting that they were obligated to present facts as they found them. Others were fearful. Careers, reputations, and even safety were at stake. This internal conflict left the team divided. Were they to produce a truthful report that risked provoking political backlash? Or a softened version that protected national stability but ignored the deeper structural problems that had fueled the violence? The integrity of the entire investigation now hung in the balance. As these battles played out behind the scenes, the public remained largely unaware. Ordinary Tanzanians continued with their lives, hoping that the investigation would bring closure, justice, and future reforms. But the investigators knew that the story had become bigger than what happened on election night. It was now about power, perception, and the delicate balance of a young democracy trying to navigate through its harshest test in years. And just when they thought the pressure couldn't grow heavier, new evidence emerged. Evidence that would change the entire course of the investigation and force everyone, from political leaders to the international community, to confront difficult questions. As the investigation into Tanzania's post-election violence continued, the focus increasingly turned to hard evidence, the kind that could not be dismissed as rumor, conjecture, or political spin. While eyewitness testimonies and media reports painted a vivid picture of chaos, bruised communities, and missing citizens, the arrival of physical and digital evidence began to transform the inquiry from a narrative exercise into an undeniable accounting of events. The first breakthrough came with the discovery of hospital records and medical reports from the night of the unrest. Medical teams had quietly documented dozens of patients treated for gunshot wounds, blunt force trauma, and severe lacerations. Injuries that clearly suggested violent encounters beyond ordinary crowd control measures. Some doctors, speaking off the record, revealed that their notes had been altered or restricted in the immediate aftermath, hinting at attempts to minimize the apparent scale of the violence. This evidence provided investigators with tangible proof that the confrontations had caused widespread physical harm, contradicting official claims that the night had been largely peaceful. Investigators also obtained satellite imagery and drone footage from independent sources. These images revealed clusters of activity in previously restricted areas. Streets filled with fleeing crowds, smoke rising from burning barricades, and armored vehicles moving through neighborhoods late at night. By cross-referencing these images with eyewitness accounts, the team was able to reconstruct a near hour-by-hour timeline of where clashes had occurred and how security forces responded. This spatial and temporal data helped clarify many previously conflicting reports and offered an unprecedentedly clear view of the scale of unrest. Digital evidence became another critical element. Despite government-imposed internet blackouts, screenshots, videos, and social media messages had been smuggled out by tech-savvy citizens and activists. Many posts showed damaged infrastructure, injured civilians, and chaotic street scenes. Investigators analyzed metadata, timestamps, and geolocation information to confirm the authenticity of these materials. These digital traces not only corroborated witness accounts but also highlighted patterns. Certain areas consistently experienced more intense clashes, and some reports of disappearances corresponded with the locations where armored vehicles and security forces had been concentrated. Perhaps the most alarming evidence emerged from forensic examinations of alleged burial sites. Investigators, working discreetly with human rights organizations, documented several shallow graves in remote areas, previously reported by villagers. Soil analysis, skeletal remains, and clothing fragments suggested that some victims of the post-election violence had indeed been disposed of in unmarked graves. The findings sparked renewed calls for transparency and accountability, as they lent credibility to long-standing allegations that deaths had been deliberately hidden to avoid public scrutiny. The investigation team also compiled confidential interviews with mid-level security officials. Many spoke anonymously about orders they had received to control crowds at all costs. Some revealed that these instructions included using intimidation tactics that blurred the lines between lawful enforcement and unlawful force. These testimonies were particularly sensitive because they implicated chain-of-command decisions, potentially linking senior officials to acts of repression. Investigators knew that documenting these accounts would be crucial for determining accountability at the highest levels. Finally, forensic accountants and electoral observers contributed evidence suggesting systemic irregularities during the vote-counting process. Reports noted discrepancies in tally sheets, sudden surges in reported votes in certain districts, and the exclusion of opposition monitors from key locations. While these findings focus primarily on the electoral process, they directly intersected with the violence, as much of the unrest was triggered by public perception of manipulated results. In other words, proving irregularities in vote handling strengthened the case that citizens' anger, though violent at times, was rooted in legitimate grievances. Taken together, this evidence created a mosaic that could no longer be ignored. It validated citizen testimonies, clarified the scope of injuries and disappearances, confirmed the existence of secret burials, and highlighted areas of procedural failure within both security and electoral institutions. The investigators realized that they were no longer piecing together scattered rumors. They were building a robust record capable of informing policy changes, accountability measures, and perhaps even legal action. Yet the presence of such compelling evidence also intensified political tensions. Every revelation, every documented injury, every confirmed unmarked grave, raised uncomfortable questions for those in power. Investigators faced pressure from multiple directions. From politicians wary of embarrassment, from international observers demanding transparency, and from citizens desperate for justice. The weight of these responsibilities made the next stages of the inquiry the most consequential yet, determining not just what had happened, but who would ultimately be held accountable. As the mounting evidence from hospitals, eyewitnesses, satellite imagery, and alleged burial sites began to crystallize, the Tanzanian government was forced to respond. Officials realized that silence was no longer an option. The world was watching, citizens were demanding answers, and international media coverage was relentless. What followed was a delicate balancing act. A mixture of public statements, partial acknowledgments, and carefully orchestrated messaging, all designed to maintain authority while attempting to project transparency. President Samia Suluhu Hassan addressed the nation on state television several weeks after the violence. Her speech was measured, emphasizing national unity, peace, and the importance of dialogue. She expressed deep regret over any loss of life, while also praising the efforts of security forces who had upheld the rule of law under difficult circumstances. Though framed as conciliatory, the speech stopped short of assigning responsibility or directly acknowledging allegations of excessive force, disappearances, or unmarked graves. This cautious response, however, did little to quell public concern. Citizens and opposition groups were quick to note the absence of clear accountability. Social media, slowly reconnecting after earlier blackouts, buzzed with debate. Citizens posted photos, recounted personal experiences, and demanded more transparency. Protesters and human rights organizations criticized the speech as insufficient, arguing that public relations statements could not substitute for a full, transparent investigation and tangible action. Within days, government ministries began releasing a series of official statements, clarifying procedural steps in the ongoing inquiry. The statements stressed that investigations were being conducted in accordance with Tanzanian law and promised that findings would be released to the public once verified. Some ministries emphasized that isolated cases of misconduct had been addressed internally, subtly suggesting that widespread or systemic abuses were unlikely. Despite these statements, public skepticism remained high. Many Tanzanians had lived through elections marked by suppression, intimidation, and restricted information. They knew that official reports could be incomplete or biased. Community meetings across urban and rural areas reflected a shared concern. Citizens wanted not only accountability for the events of election night, but also reforms to prevent future abuses. Calls for independent oversight, legal protection for witnesses, and inclusion of international observers became common demands at town halls and local council gatherings. Meanwhile, preliminary conclusions from the investigation team began to emerge internally. Investigators cautiously drafted reports indicating several key findings. The scale of violence was larger than initially acknowledged, affecting multiple regions and leaving hundreds injured. Disappearances and unmarked burials had occurred in certain hotspots, reinforcing fears of deliberate cover-ups. Excessive force by security forces was documented in numerous cases, including shootings, beatings, and unlawful detentions. Electoral irregularities contributed directly to public unrest, particularly in districts where opposition monitoring had been obstructed. Communication failures, from both authorities and misinformation circulating online, exacerbated tensions, transforming initial protests into widespread unrest. These preliminary findings, though significant, were only the beginning. The government faced a dilemma. Releasing them publicly could spark renewed outrage, while withholding them entirely risked deepening public mistrust. Investigators themselves were acutely aware that their credibility would be judged not only on the evidence they had collected but also on the transparency and fairness of their final report. Amid this uncertainty, pressure from international organizations continued to mount. Diplomatic channels emphasized the importance of impartiality, urging the government to allow both domestic and external scrutiny. Observers highlighted that the credibility of Tanzania's democratic institutions and its international reputation depended on the integrity of the investigation's conclusions. For ordinary citizens, the situation was emotionally exhausting. Hope for justice was tempered by years of skepticism. Families of the missing and survivors of violence waited anxiously, uncertain whether their testimonies would lead to accountability or be absorbed into bureaucratic inertia. Yet despite the caution and cautionary signals from the government, the preliminary conclusions offered a glimmer of transparency, a promise that the truth, however difficult, might finally emerge. Tanzania stood at a critical crossroads. The government's response, the investigation's emerging conclusions, and the public's growing demands for justice were converging. The next steps would determine whether the nation could heal, reform its institutions, and rebuild trust, or whether the wounds from this post-election violence would fester for years to come. As the investigation into Tanzania's post-election violence progressed, it became clear that uncovering the truth was only part of the battle. The process was fraught with challenges, controversies, and political pressures that threatened to compromise the integrity of the inquiry and fuel public distrust. What initially began as a methodical collection of evidence and testimonies evolved into a high-stakes contest of influence, perception, and control. One of the first major challenges was political interference. Investigators, while trying to maintain independence, faced repeated attempts to influence which findings could be emphasized and which should be downplayed. Some high-level officials urged that certain incidents be classified as isolated, rather than systemic, effectively minimizing accountability for security personnel. Mid-level bureaucrats occasionally resisted providing full documentation, citing confidentiality or national security, leaving gaps in the official record. Investigators who pushed for transparency sometimes received warnings, subtle or explicit, reminding them of the political sensitivities at stake. Adding to these challenges was the circulation of leaks and partial reports. Early drafts of the investigation occasionally found their way to journalists, creating a whirlwind of speculation. Some media outlets published summaries that highlighted the most shocking findings: unmarked graves, police brutality, and electoral irregularities, while omitting the context provided by investigators. This selective reporting fueled public outrage and mistrust, as citizens debated whether the government was hiding information or if the leaks themselves were politically motivated. Social media amplified these debates, sometimes spreading misinformation, further complicating the investigation's delicate work. Civil society organizations and human rights activists also faced dilemmas. They had the evidence and testimonies to hold authorities accountable, but were cautious about how public criticism could affect the outcome. Some activists received intimidation, ranging from subtle surveillance to anonymous threats warning against provoking unrest. Others worried that politicizing their findings might discredit their work or alienate parts of the public. This created a tense environment where even speaking the truth became a risky proposition. The investigation itself encountered logistical and technical obstacles. Remote areas where incidents had occurred were difficult to access, especially where roads were damaged or security concerns remained high. Collecting forensic evidence from suspected burial sites required specialized teams and equipment, sometimes delayed by bureaucracy. Digital evidence, although crucial, had to be meticulously verified to avoid false accusations. Metadata analysis, geolocation confirmation, and witness corroboration consumed weeks of painstaking work, all while pressure mounted to produce public results quickly. Public reaction to these challenges was intense. Families of the missing became increasingly vocal, demanding faster action and clearer communication. Citizens questioned why preliminary findings were not immediately released and whether the investigation was truly independent. Grassroots movements organized forums, marches, and online campaigns, emphasizing that justice delayed risked becoming justice denied. Ordinary Tanzanians expressed frustration over what they saw as a slow-moving process that seemed to protect institutions rather than address human suffering. The international community, too, weighed in. Diplomatic sources expressed concern that delays or interference could damage Tanzania's credibility on the global stage. Human rights organizations urged both transparency and accountability, stressing that any perception of bias would undermine trust in the final report. At the same time, some foreign observers cautioned against sensationalism, emphasizing that the investigation needed to be thorough and evidence-based to avoid inflaming tensions further. Despite these pressures, the investigation team persevered. They implemented stricter protocols to secure evidence, conducted additional cross-checks, and established confidential channels for witnesses to provide information safely. They engaged forensic experts, legal advisors, and independent monitors to ensure the work remained credible. Even as political and public pressures intensified, the investigators were determined to produce a final report that was not just a document, but a reflection of truth. By the end of Section 8, it was clear that the investigation was more than a search for facts. It had become a test of institutional integrity, civic trust, and the resilience of Tanzanian democracy itself. How the team navigated these obstacles would determine whether the country could reconcile with the events of the post-election period, or whether lingering controversies and unanswered questions would continue to haunt the nation. After months of painstaking work, cross-verification of evidence, interviews with witnesses, digital analysis, and field investigations, the team preparing Tanzania's post-election inquiry began formulating preliminary conclusions. These early findings marked a pivotal moment in the nation's path toward understanding the full scope of the violence and determining potential accountability. Yet, even before they were formally released, the conclusions sparked debate, both within the government and among the public. The preliminary report highlighted several key points. First, it confirmed that widespread violence had occurred across multiple regions, leaving hundreds injured and, in certain areas, dozens dead. Evidence from hospitals, eyewitness testimonies, and forensic investigations demonstrated that these were not isolated incidents, but rather a series of coordinated responses by security personnel that escalated tensions instead of calming them. Second, the report acknowledged the existence of disappearances and unmarked burial sites, though it emphasized that establishing exact numbers would require continued investigation. The team noted patterns suggesting that some of these deaths may have been deliberately concealed, raising serious questions about accountability within law enforcement structures. Third, the report addressed the role of misinformation and communication breakdowns. It emphasized how rumors, social media posts, and a lack of timely official communication amplified public fear and anger, fueling clashes in urban centers and rural districts alike. The investigators noted that while misinformation did not justify violence, it created conditions in which protests could escalate rapidly. Finally, the preliminary conclusions stressed electoral irregularities. While some were procedural in nature, such as mismanaged polling stations or delayed reporting of results, others were more serious, including the exclusion of opposition monitors and inconsistencies in vote tallies. Investigators stated that these irregularities, combined with the perception of unfairness, had contributed directly to public outrage. As these preliminary conclusions circulated, public reaction was intense. Civil society groups hailed the report as a step toward accountability, emphasizing that it validated long-held fears and testimonies. Families of victims felt that their experiences were finally being recognized, though many stressed that acknowledgement alone was not enough. Citizens called for swift action, including prosecution of those responsible for excessive use of force and legal reforms to prevent similar incidents in future elections. However, the response from political circles was mixed. Some government officials cautiously welcomed the findings, describing them as constructive and necessary for national reconciliation. Others, particularly from within the ruling party, criticized the emphasis on security force misconduct, arguing that it risked undermining public trust in institutions. Opposition leaders seized the report as evidence of systemic failure, demanding immediate reforms and legal accountability at the highest levels. International observers and media organizations closely followed these developments. They noted that while the preliminary report provided a more accurate picture of the post-election unrest, its effectiveness depended on transparency, follow-through, and enforcement of recommendations. Diplomatic voices emphasized that Tanzania's credibility, both regionally and globally, would hinge on how seriously these conclusions were treated and whether they led to meaningful reforms. The preliminary findings also sparked public debate about the broader implications for democracy in Tanzania. Citizens questioned how similar events could be prevented in future elections, how trust in the electoral system could be restored, and whether security forces could be reformed to respect citizens' rights. Town halls, radio programs, and social media became arenas for discussions on justice, governance, and accountability. After months of meticulous investigation, cross-referencing evidence, and analyzing testimonies from across Tanzania, the final report on the post-election violence was officially released. Its publication marked a historic moment for the nation, the culmination of a painstaking effort to uncover the truth, address grievances, and propose measures aimed at preventing future unrest. The final report largely confirmed the preliminary conclusions. The post-election violence had been widespread, caused by a combination of public frustration, misinformation, and excessive security responses. Importantly, it added clarity to many of the unresolved questions that had dominated public discourse for months. Investigators detailed patterns of misconduct among certain security units, highlighted unmarked burial sites, and documented the systemic challenges that had prevented transparency during both the election and the subsequent unrest. Alongside these findings, the report issued comprehensive recommendations. Among the most significant were calls for security sector reforms, strengthening accountability mechanisms for police and military personnel, revising protocols for crowd control, and implementing mandatory training focused on human rights and de-escalation techniques. Electoral reforms, enhancing transparency during vote counting, guaranteeing the presence of independent observers, improving voter education, and developing faster and more reliable communication systems for reporting results. Legal accountability, initiating legal proceedings against individuals found to have engaged in unlawful actions during the post-election unrest, including excessive use of force and obstruction of justice. Public engagement and transparency, establishing open channels for citizens to report grievances, increasing communication during electoral processes, and ensuring that civil society organizations are actively involved in monitoring elections. Support for victims, providing medical, psychological, and social support for those injured or affected by the violence, as well as assistance for families of the missing. The official release of the report generated a wave of reactions. Civil society organizations and human rights groups welcomed it as a critical step toward accountability, emphasizing that acknowledgement and transparency were essential for national healing. Opposition parties argued that the report reinforced the need for systemic reform and vowed to push for implementation of its recommendations. Meanwhile, government officials reiterated their commitment to addressing the findings, promising action while emphasizing stability and national unity. The broader public response was mixed but engaged. Many Tanzanians felt a sense of relief that the investigation had been conducted with diligence, and that the experiences of victims were finally recognized. However, there remained skepticism about whether the recommendations would translate into tangible changes, especially concerning legal accountability for security personnel and electoral reform. Communities across the country debated how best to balance justice with reconciliation, reflecting a nation grappling with both its wounds and its future. International observers and media outlets highlighted Tanzania's approach as an example of the challenges faced by emerging democracies confronting contested elections and post-election violence. They praised the investigative rigor but emphasized that the true test would be in implementation, whether reforms would prevent future unrest, ensure accountability, and restore public confidence in democratic institutions. In the months following the report, some reforms began to take shape. Select security units underwent retraining, voter education programs were expanded, and legal proceedings against individuals implicated in excessive use of force were initiated. While progress was incremental and sometimes slow, the process signaled a commitment to addressing systemic issues rather than ignoring them. By the conclusion of Section 10, it was evident that Tanzania's journey through post-election violence, investigation, and accountability had left a lasting imprint on the nation's political and social landscape. Citizens had demanded truth, and the process, though imperfect, had delivered unprecedented transparency. The events served as both a cautionary tale and an opportunity, a reminder of the fragility of public trust, the power of collective voice, and the importance of robust institutions that protect democracy and human rights. As Tanzania slowly recovers from the turmoil of its post-election violence, the investigations have revealed a truth long demanded by its citizens, that accountability, transparency, and reform are essential for the health of any democracy. From eyewitness testimonies to international media scrutiny, and from forensic evidence to the final report's recommendations, the nation has confronted both the darkest and most resilient aspects of its society. The journey has been painful, but it has also sparked an important conversation about trust, justice, and the responsibilities of both leaders and citizens. The hope now rests on whether the lessons learned will translate into meaningful reforms, strengthening institutions, protecting human rights, and ensuring that the voices of the people are heard in every future election. If you found this story insightful and want to stay informed about events that shape our world, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, so you never miss a deep dive into history, investigations, and the untold stories behind the headlines.